Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a Classics Revisited webinar. I just went ahead and started the webinar, so we're going to let people start coming in, getting settled. We are so happy to be continuing this great conversation and providing a work break with more great titles of our world. Today, we are continuing with our political philosophy conversations and talking about John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. We're going to give everyone just a few moments to log in, get settled, get their wits about them to prepare for all great questions at the end of this conversation. While we do that, please make sure you set your chat panel to sharing with all attendees and panelists. That's why if you have a comment or something that you want to share with the entire group, everybody sees it, not just those of us who are running the webinar. And let us know where you're joining from today. We'd love to hear from people who are on. Published in 1971, A Theory of Justice was John Rawls's initiation work that really changed the face of 20th century political philosophy. And a lot of discussions have happened since then. He was really honored by President Clinton in the later part of the 20th century, and he is just an interesting philosopher in this time period. We are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion and would love to hear all of the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. Today, I once again have that great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Michael Sugrue to our ongoing webinar series, Classics Revisited. I always enjoy talking to him, and I hope you enjoy listening to not only his lectures, but our discussions at the end. Dr. Sugrue is a professor. He is a graduate of the Great Books Program. He earned his BA in History from the University of Chicago and his MA, Masters of Philosophy, and PhD in History from Columbia University. Professor Sugrue has taught at prestigious universities such as Princeton, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and many more. My name is Christy Gold, for those of you who don't know. I'm a global marketing specialist here at Bibliotheca, and behind the scenes we have my colleague Mackenzie Crane helping to make sure everything runs smoothly. Throughout the process, she'll be putting some various links in the chat that help with the discussion, and would love to chat and answer any questions that you may have. We will be sharing the chat log with all attendees. So once again, if you didn't hear it when you came in, make sure you switch your settings to all attendees and panelists. That's why we can share all the great comments. And then if you have specific questions for the professor or to include into the discussion after the lecture, please use that Q&A panel. It is a pop-out panel, so sometimes gets hidden. Just to give you a heads up, make sure you pop it out and type in a lot of those questions. The like button does help float the most popular questions to the top, so please use that feature if you happen to see a similar question or something you just want answered that someone else may have asked. Once again, we are looking for today's webinar as a give and take discussion and would love to hear all the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to the professor. We did pre-record his lecture, but he will be joining us at the end for a live Q&A. Thank you. Sit back and enjoy his lecture on John Rawls's A Theory of Justice.
Groundbreaking work, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971 to great acclaim, and justifiably so. It's a very new, or it's a very interesting and complex account of what justice is. And what Rawls is trying to convince us of is that justice should be regarded as fairness. Now, he's going to take elements of the Western tradition, like the social contract, and also elements of Kantian ethics, in the sense that he likes clear and fast rules, which are derived from carefully stated principles. So Rawls is looking for an alternative to utilitarianism. Now, there are many ways in which we might want to try and analyze that. First off, as a matter of fact, utilitarianism sort of ran out of steam in a lot of places. England itself, of course, but the United States as well. I mean, there's always been an element of utilitarianism in American policy, but the place where utilitarianism actually really thrived was Australia, right? And Peter Singer is the most prominent in the line of Australian utilitarians. Now, Rawls wants to focus on utilitarianism because he sees it as the last great digression in Anglophone philosophy, and he's targeting that not because there are actually all that many people trying to defend utilitarianism in the U.S. in the 1960s. Now, let me step back from this, ask you to look at the historical context. Why would a man like Rawls make the decisions and make the arguments that he does? Rawls was deeply religious. While he was an undergraduate at Princeton, he intended to be a minister, but his service in the army during World War II in the Pacific horrified him sufficiently that he gave up on the idea of being a minister and instead decided to become a secular philosopher of politics, particularly the avatar of a new conception of what a just political order would look like. Now, in many ways, the utilitarian maxim is useful. I mean, the greatest good for the greatest number. There are many cases in which that's actually a perfectly satisfactory deployment of your moral thinking. For example, when you're figuring out how to deploy medicine, well, get it where it does the most good. That makes good sense, actually. The point is that utilitarianism is a very useful tool, but it's not the silver bullet that it claimed to be the solution to all problems in morals and legislation. That it doesn't manage to do. It leads to some frightful cases. And that's where the Kantian element is often invoked. There are certain lines we don't cross, regardless of whether it's useful in the sense of a cost-benefit analysis or if it's advantageous. Right and wrong aren't fungible. You can't move the goalposts. What Rawls does is he takes the old idea first of a social contract. Now, people like Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau created a quasi-mythical social contract that, cavemen or primitive people did when they were atomized one way or another in the state of nature. In Hobbes's account, which is the first of them, all the cavemen put down their clubs at the same time and made some particular guy the sovereign. And then he got to rule over everyone. Now, this, which is quasi-mythical, and military capitulation, Hobbes says, are the two real origins of government. The reason why he doesn't go strictly with military capitulation is it makes it impossible to figure out how the army got started in the first place. All right. So there has to be some degree of agreement. Now, what Rawls is going to do, he says, look, there is no such thing as a social contract, but it's a kind of a useful regulative idea because it tells us what obligations we give and take to everyone else in society. So what Rawls says is, let's use the social contract in the state of nature as a heuristic. All we know, all right, about ourselves is very limited. And then we look into the structure of the society that we would contractually agree with and ask what properties would it have? Well, Rawls argues that it would eliminate, for example, institutions like slavery or the Indian caste system or serfdom. And the reason why is that because we don't know whether we're going to be where we're going to be in society, we make our judgments on the basis of what's the worst that can go wrong. So what Rawls is going to want to do is be a risk minimizer and then put the positions that everyone has prior to making this social contract, put them behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. You don't know if you're rich or poor. You don't know if you're talented or not talented. You don't know if you what kind of disposition you have. All you know is that you have a life, and that's the only one you get. So what do you want to do? The rational thing, according to Rawls, is to create a world in which the least well off are pretty well off. And the reason why that is that since they are the least well off and they're pretty well off, that means the entirety of the society is at least that well off, and in many cases better off than that. What Rawls is trying to do is solve a problem that utilitarianism gives us, particularly in the American context of the 1960s. Black people in America, maybe an eighth of the population, something along those lines, have been ill-treated and enslaved and subordinated for a very long time. And the problem with utilitarianism is that it could easily be manipulated so as to justify something like slavery in America, because if you had a large enough number of white people and they had enough British happiness units, if they had enough enjoyment from enslaving an eighth of the population, depending upon how miserable that eighth of the population was, it's entirely possible to imagine a utilitarian justification for a great many genuine evils. And it doesn't matter whether 1/8 of the population or 1% of the population or 99% of the population is enslaved. The Rawlsian argument is that if you're in the state of nature and you haven't got the social contract yet, you're going to minimize the risks that you take by eliminating things like slavery and serfdom and the caste system. You will reduce, at any rate, the inequalities on the basis of wealth. You don't know if you're going to be black or white, so you're going to eliminate racist disparities. You also don't know if you're going to be male or female, so inequality on the basis of sex is not going to be endorsed. So what you're going to get is a very powerful welfare state, which would treat everyone as good or better than the least advantaged. Okay. Now, a second thing, Rawls actually describes this in very precise detail. The first principle that he has, and this is a very precise principled argument. The first principle that he has is that he wants the maximum liberty for everybody that's consistent with an equal liberty for everybody else. And that is an attractive idea. And he wants equal access to primary goods. The difficulty emerges when we try and figure out exactly what the primary goods are. All right. Certain kinds of freedom, for example, are primary goods. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech. The difficulty is where the primary goods begin and where the secondary goods take it up. For example, is property a primary good or secondary good? I think that Rawls regards it as secondary. One wonders about, for example, freedom of contract. All right. Because contract law involves not just business, but things like marriage. The difficulties or the interesting complexities of Rawls are when you move from the level of equal liberty for everybody to his second group of principles. And the first is that everybody should be able to get access to office holding. So, in other words, anyone who's talented should be able to get the development of those talents and should have a shot at influencing political life. In other words, there should be no exclusive political caste. We wouldn't want that if we were judging from the veil of ignorance. The second thing that Rawls wants us to do is called the difference principle. This is going to be centered on creating equality as a good very close to, just second to liberty. So we get the maximum liberty it's possible with everybody else getting an equal package of liberties. The next thing we get is equality. And this equality is going to be based upon the proposition that human beings are social animals and their capacities are properly social. So he has a collective view of human capacities. He is not an individualist in that sense. And Rawls is creating a kind of, can I put it, a kind of mechanism to make sure that bad inequalities don't emerge. Now, according to Rawls, the only justifiable inequalities are those that serve everybody's interest. And they, in particular, serve the interest of those who are least advantaged. So whoever it is that is the least advantaged in our society, we have to be particularly conscious of how they're treated, because we know once we've improved the lot of the least advantaged, that means that everyone else in society is doing at least that well or better. So here's the thought. Rawls wants a moral theory that doesn't allow for tyranny of the majority. He doesn't want 7/8 of the population, or 51% of the population, or 99% of the population to impose oppressive, malevolent rules on a minority. Utilitarianism has a real problem with tyranny of the majority. Rawls does not, because he says, look, no matter what the utilitarian consequence of a policy, if it is harmful to the least among us, we don't do it. So what he's doing is judging the moral status of politics and ethics and legislation by asking, how does it affect the least among us? And here's where you see Rawls's religious impulses coming out. He's trying to restrain them, but I think ultimately it doesn't work. In a way, you could say that it seems to me what Rawls is doing is creating a kind of logical Unitarianism, something that reasonable people could agree with, but it doesn't move people emotionally. And that's testimony to its Kantian heritage. He's looking for universal rules that apply equally to everybody. And that's why he wants to say that we will be judged on the basis of how we treat the least among us. Now, I've read pretty closely the whole 500-page monster book of Rawls's theory of justice, both the early version and the late version that got revised. And he's a brilliant writer, but ultimately I find him unconvincing. It's not that I think he's wrong, it's that I think he's trying to do the impossible. He's trying to pull Christian rabbits out of logic, out of rational hats. In other words, the difficulty that I have is that Rawls assumes things which are not obvious in any rational sense, like, for example, human equality, And these are religious values, and I myself agree with them. I embrace them. But what that means is that much of Rawls's work is an enormous amount of intellectual calisthenics, which ultimately are not going to convince anybody that wasn't convinced to begin with. I might describe Rawls's theory of justice as the world's longest meditation on a single passage from the Gospel of Matthew. Whatsoever you do to the least of my brethren, that you do unto me. Okay, well, if you stop and think about the difference principle, what it means is we will judge politics and policy on the basis of how it treats the least among us, because that is the standard that those of us who are more capable and more advantaged and more fortunate are going to be held to. Now, there's much that's attractive in Rawls, but it's easy to go too far, and it's easy to push Rawls where it doesn't work very well. Rawls assumes that human capacities belong to the human collective rather than to the individuals involved. And in that sense, everyone's entitled to the brilliance of Einstein, not just Einstein. And everyone's entitled to a slice of the inventions of Edison, not just Edison. And the idea is something like those that are fortunate enough to be raised in a good environment can't be praised for that because they didn't choose their environment. And those that are given good DNA, which allows them to have high functioning mental capacities or artistic capacities, still can't claim any special merit for that. So what he's doing is trying to abolish the idea of desert, which many people, and sometimes for good reason, find difficult to believe. On the other hand, what he's trying to remind us is that we don't completely make ourselves. We are at best partially self-made people. And we are also indebted to the society that gave us things like the English language and a whole package of other things that we get from civilization. And Rawls is the founder of what I would call a benign Gnostic cult focused on the well-being of the least among us. It makes a worthwhile contribution to our political discussions because we need somebody to look after such folks. I'm not convinced that it's the only or the ultimate standard by which we judge morals in legislation, but that it makes a contribution in the same way and at the same level as Aristotle's golden mean or Kant's categorical imperative. I think that's the case. So John Rawls was a great political philosopher and a saintly man. I don't find his arguments especially persuasive or compelling. It seems like there's a far too compliant or jumpy element in just about every chapter for me. But I still agree with him in a broad general sense, and that there's no just regime that does not pay attention to the welfare of the least among us. And while I'm not sure it's rational or logical to believe that, on the other hand, I'm not sure that rationality and logic are absolutely necessary in the Kantian sense. Maybe sometimes our empathy for other people is a worthwhile impulse to have. Groundbreaking.
Wrong button. I almost went ahead and started your lecture all over again there. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us again. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this Q&A. I have to say that this is our third political philosophy this year. And it's all of the questions that I was looking at when I was coming up with it. There are so many ins and outs, and I suppose that's why there are classes and philosophers and everything, because you just basically can sit there and question each other for, who knows how long. So do you have any additional thoughts before we get into the questions regarding,
I think that strict separation between disciplines is mostly for the benefit of accountants. In other words, the university has to figure out what department you're in so they know what line to pull from when they're paying your salary. But the disciplines themselves are not. They're all aspects of the same reality.
Yeah.
So history and philosophy and literature and religion and mythology are not really separate disciplines. They're just different ways of looking at the same thing. And what it involves is each of them has their own vocabulary. And then within that, each thinker develops his own lingo. So, there's a lot of work in figuring out how to figure out what they're telling you to begin with. On the other hand, I find what they're telling you, at least some cases, worthwhile. In other words, I wouldn't want to go without, say, Aristotle's golden mean or Kant's categorical imperative or the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. They're all good things, but they're tools that have limits. And you're going to find out that good carpenters use the right tool for the job.
Well, and that brings up my first question. And before we fully get into it, for those of you who are here, if you do have a question, please feel free to put it into the Q&A, and we'll definitely get to it. This is, such a great discussion, and I'm sure there's a lot of just, interesting conversations to be had. Going into what you just said, we have had previous Classics Revisited sessions on both John Stuart Mills's utilitarianism as well as Kant's Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, which you brought up both of them in this lecture. You did speak a little bit of some of the differences between Rawls and these two philosophers, but I would also see some similarities with some of Rawls's perceptions in both Mills and Kant, and how he put together his formula on utilizing different aspects of both philosophers. Could you just go in a bit more into their similarities and differences between the three that you've really been exposed in?
Sure. Kant is focused on intentionality, and he creates hard and fast rules. The categorical imperative tells you you're not supposed to tell lies and you're not supposed to commit murders, and there's no exception to the rule, right? Because you can't universalize the maxim. Kantians, generally speaking, I think would make very good judges because they're very rule-oriented and have a strong sense of the connection between theory and practice. They don't allow you to fudge anything. Now, the utilitarian is trying to create the greatest good for the greatest number, but what he means by good is pleasure, and that's a debatable idea. I'd be tempted to think that there might be some pleasures that are bad for you and some pains that are good. And again, not attractive, but I think even children should get their inoculations, even if they don't like them, because granted they're painful, it's actually good for them to get it. So I'd be inclined to say that the utilitarian argument is something we go to when we're making large abstract decisions. The Kantian argument, when we get down to the practical reality of things, we're either obeying the rules or we're not. The difficulty is that some of the things that Mill would end up endorsing, Kant would say, we just don't do that. The example of America, where 1/8 of the population is subordinated and enslaved, that's a utilitarian nightmare. If people really like it and being racist and cruel enough, you can justify that from a utilitarian perspective. And Kant and Rawls says that's our problem. He's thinking in the 1950s and 60s, how can I reformulate the idea of justice so that it doesn't allow those nightmares? And he says what that means is ultimately Kant was right. There are certain lines we do not cross. We don't sacrifice anybody in order to achieve some utilitarian greater good, much less do we sacrifice millions of people. Now, here the problem is, and it's a funny turn of events, but the danger with Rawls is not tyranny of the majority. He's got that under control. His danger, I suspect, is something close to tyranny of the minority. Suppose you could do some very trivial harm to the least among us. And as a result, a demon would offer us this possibility, but he says, look, if you are willing to do some minor harm to the least among us, I will show you the cure for cancer. well, okay, the utilitarian ka-ching, he wants that immediately. The Kantian says, I'm sorry, but I can't do that. And he's really sorry because he sees the advantages. And the Rawlsian says, Kant is right. Now, nearly nobody agrees with Kant and Rawls. When the advantage is big enough, we often become utilitarians. Kant and Rawls just shake their head and say, you don't understand what you're buying into. Because once you accept the idea of sacrificing even one person in the smallest way, there's no reason why you can't do it to 2 people or 200 or 2 million. And they're right.
With that, so unlike utilitarianism, where the greater good is the majority of the society, doesn't Rawls's theory create a different form of utilitarianism? In other words, like if everyone were equal and had the same advantages, going with the veil of ignorance theory, wouldn't that be better for the greater good?
Well, it might well be better for the greater good, but what he's trying to make sure is that each atom within that body politic, that it's better for them. In other words, he is not willing to look at the whole greater good and make his moral judgments on that basis. He said, did we achieve the greatest good possible without sacrificing even the least among us?
Okay.
It's a noble and beautiful theory in many ways. I'm not sure it's practical because, like I said, when you compare, I don't know, harming one person and getting cancer cured, most people are going to say, no, I'm sorry. That's not acceptable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it goes to the idea, I made a note while you were talking again. It's probably the 4th or 5th time I've actually listened to you and your theories. Based on like the fact that it's a beautiful theory, it's one that most people in a sense can get behind to bring equality. Like the vast majority of the world wants equality for everybody. They don't want poverty. They don't want starving children, starving anybody. They don't want disease and everything like that. But would Rawls's theory be almost an easier theory to accept fully if you were building a society from the ground up versus trying to change people's current mindset, like essentially change the current layout?
That's a very good point. Rawls's idea of the veil of ignorance, where we don't know what we are, that's actually a very powerful idea, because what it does is remove all of what Kant called heteronomy. You don't have any of these specific impulses that characterize you as an individual. You just have to decide what you would want as a kind of minimalist person. You don't know your sex, your race, your age, your health, or anything. And what Rawls thinks is that what you would do is be a rational risk minimizer, because you might be born the least in society. Now, it's not clear to me why it's more rational to be a risk minimizer than it is to be an opportunity maximizer. Right? I mean, it might be. I think that it appeals to professors because professors tend to be kind of timid, bookish people, and they spend a lot of time in their books, but they're not usually people whose lives are full of action, right? So I think minimizing risk appeals to intellectuals and perhaps insurance adjusters, whereas maximizing opportunity appeals to a different strain in our psyche. And it's not by itself any more irrational, I don't think.
One of the videos I saw that Kenzie had shared it while you were doing it, it's I found a nice breakdown of Rawls's theory as well. It's about a 15-minute long video, and really just focuses in on what his theories are and trying to break it down into a more understandable nature. And one of the ways he had mentioned it was like not necessarily taking away everything, but like if you were to win a lottery, like, but you don't know where that lottery is going to send you, then would you want to gamble that you're going to be in the south side of Detroit in a smaller apartment with very little income, or that you're going to be, there? And so he broke it down in the sense of like not necessarily starting from scratch as a human, but like everybody's slates are wiped clean and you can get sent to this house that's already been built or this house that's already been built. What's your gamble? And so therefore, most people at that point, if they're looking at it that way, they would take the gamble to get everybody equal so that no matter what lottery number they draw, they're going to go to a place that they're comfortable. Okay. So it's just kind of an interesting thought process with that.
Well, what we want to make sure is that we don't we don't create anyone who's expendable.
Yeah.
That the dignity of human beings is such that we can't trade that for any advantageous collection of consequences. And of course, the problem with this is that the Kantians and the Rawlsians are so hardcore on this, is that if you dangle small evils against really big advantages, the utilitarian says, come on, boys, eventually you have to give this up. But I don't think Rawls and Kant would. I said, look, I think they would retort, right and wrong are real things. This is the line, and that's all I have to say about that.
So going with Sorry, yeah. I didn't mean to stop you there. Going with that, one of the questions that came in from registration is a just and morally acceptable society the same as an ethical society?
Yes. In other words, he's going to use, what he's doing is trying to reconcile politics and ethics, which has been a main theme of Western thought since Plato's Republic. Mm-hmm. How does politics relate to ethics? If there's no connection, we have chaos and disaster. So in order to avoid that disaster, because mutual injustice will destroy any society, we have to find a way of creating some consensus about what we believe good and evil.
Okay. And another question that came in from registration going with that thought process is with free will. It is impossible for a just and morally acceptable society since people differ in their opinions of what is right and what is wrong. Is this a flawed statement?
Well, the empirical fact that people have different opinions tells us nothing about the reality that those opinions may connect to. Now, if they don't connect to any reality, then calling them good or evil or true or false doesn't make any sense at all. It's just whatever you want. But if it is with reference to something else, well, not all opinions are equally good. Not all utterances are equally true. 2 and 2 is 4, not 5. On the other hand, the dream of Plato to turn everything into math so that we can get absolute answers forever to everything, I think that's unlikely. To distinguish between the domains which are properly subjective, like, I don't know, is broccoli good? Does it taste nice? And properly objective, things like water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. I think that we're always negotiating and renegotiating that line. And it's not exactly a line, it's actually kind of a gray area. And many of our judgments about beauty or truth or goodness are within that gray domain, but that doesn't mean that we can't or can avoid making such judgments. So we do the best we can.
Interesting. One of the questions that just came in is, can you explain a little bit more about justifiable inequality that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah. For example, it would be very inconvenient for us if no one went to medical school and we didn't have doctors graduating who were highly competent, highly motivated, highly intelligent. They have, on the whole, skills which suit them to this. And that's why medical school admissions committees are so strict. They want to make sure they get the right sort of students. We can offer them a superior wage to give them an incentive to do that, because even the least among us gets sick. And that person is better off having doctors available than not having doctors available. So it is possible to justify those inequalities, which contribute not just to the individuals that possess those advantages, but to everybody, including the least among us. All right. Can you see how that would make sense? In other words, we need to give doctors a reason to spend 6 years in school,
Yeah.
and nobody likes it, and it's really hard. What we get out of that is an advantage for everybody.
Okay. Okay. We're going to move on to Rawls himself for just a little bit. I have a question or two here about him. Did Rawls stay Christian all his life?
No, he was a lapsed Christian. My point is, it's easier to say you're lapsed than to completely be lapsed. Even the most radical atheists like Nietzsche or Freud or the Marquis de Sade, they're all in some ways trapped by their rejection of Christianity because they're stuck inverting what they think is demanded of them, of what theists believe. So it's like former communists, former Marxists. They always have a strain of that thinking in their later thinking. In other words, and you can see it with how thorough their critique of Marxism is. They know where all the bodies are buried. Well, somewhat the same is true for Christians. Yeah, you can give up on Christianity, but the people that give up on Christianity don't generally write long, long books about justice. Mm-hmm. Generally, they go into some self-seeking kind of mode and focus on their own aspirations and desires. Here's a guy who said, look, I'm giving up Christian myth, but I sure do wish I could get people to behave in a Christian way, because he believes, look, if you don't believe that the least among us matters, as Jesus said in one line, you're not going to believe it after 500 pages of Rawls. If you do believe that before you read 500 pages of Rawls, look, you can save yourself a lot of intellectual sweating, because the calisthenics aren't really necessary.
Yeah. The other question I had on Rawls, and this was one of my own, is in my research on the book, liberalism and Rawls was paired quite often when it comes to just the political thought process and nature of liberalism. And then I believe later in his life in the 90s, he may have written a book with liberalism, actually, even in the title, if I remember correctly.
The title of it, yeah.
Can you kind of explain how, Rawls, did his theories progress liberalism in especially in America? Was he kind of the founder? Can you explain some of that relationship with Rawls and liberalism?
Okay, this is complicated because, liberalism means a lot of things.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. That's where my confusion was starting.
That's part of the problem. In other words, people throw it around and they're often arguing past each other because they don't define the terms. What Rawls means is a regime that meets the first standard. It gives the maximum possible liberty to everybody that's consistent with an equal liberty for everybody else. So everybody gets the same package of liberties. The next thing, though, brings us to how inequality is going to be handled. We know we're going to maximize liberty, but now it seems we want to minimize inequality. And the only ones we're going to allow for are the ones that actually help everybody, not just those that have the advantages, or not just, say, the people that can afford doctors, right? Yeah. If you're going to have an inequality, you have to make sure that the least among us has some way of paying for the doctor. And we allow that inequality because it serves everybody's interest. So for that, what that means is that Rawls' definition of injustice is really simple. It's any inequality that doesn't serve the general interest. Okay. And here I don't mean most, I mean everybody. He's very strict.
Interesting. Okay, that helps a little bit. Moving back into his theory, we have a question here from a guest saying, does Rawls's theory run against the concept of natural rights by reducing them to or replacing them with socially conferred artifacts? For example, are rights purely products of social agreement rather than inherent liberties, entitlements?
That's an excellent question. Go to the head of the class for that. That is a big deal. Yes, it is inconsistent with the idea of natural rights that we have in the founding documents of the United States among the founders. When Jefferson says that they are endowed by their creator with certain rights, and that these rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was originally property, Jefferson is stating something about the natural moral order, which is discovered, not invented. Later on, I think Rawls is going to be a conventionalist. I think that he's going to say, look, we said, once he gives up Christianity and the metaphysics that's attached to it, then he has to say, well, look, we're just down here. And that means that it's not going to have any, how can I put this, any metaphysical justification, or as he put it in his book, Political Liberalism, he wants the justification for his views to be political, not metaphysical. Right? They're going to be this worldly, which means that the rights we're going to have are going to be conventional. And like any convention, the problem is what legitimizes this convention as opposed to any other. And then you have a series of problems. All right. And this is intrinsic to the subtraction of religion from the traditions of political thought and political theory. Now, the difficulty that we have here is that what turns out to be the case is usually political theorists are going to build something that takes the function of religion or serves the function of religion and put that into their theory, and it's not going to count as a religion. Others, I mean, if you think of somebody like Rousseau, strangely enough, in the Social Contract, he says, here's what we need for as far as a civil religion goes. Now, I think that Rawls is trying to demythologize liberalism. The difficulty is that you're not going to get natural rights out of that. And that means that it's incompatible with the founding documents of America. Yes, it's a great question.
Yeah, and actually, I was very happy one of our audience members wrote that too, because I had written out a question saying that I feel as though A Theory of Justice is not a major groundbreaking work of art in a certain sense, because of documents like, I was going to take a bit from the American, like the Declaration of Independence, where we hold these truths self-evident that all men are created equal, including the Constitution with we the people. Now we're talking just like the basic sentences, but how is this new thought process, except for the fact that Rawls went further to say we haven't done that. We need to continue to push it.
Okay, what he's going to say is that the Declaration doesn't go far enough in establishing equality. It does a good job with liberty, but the problem is that until we get to the equality of the states, it never gets mentioned in the Constitution until the 14th Amendment, which is a very strange fact. Yeah. Right. But so the American Revolution was a revolution about political liberty, not about political equality. We're going to have to wait for the French Revolution for that. And that's part of why it terrifies Americans. Rawls is, how can I put this? Rawls is trying to rethink the question of justice in a new intellectual context. If you try and sell the original founders' idea of natural law, you're going to get a small number of very devoted followers in the intellectual world. I mean, in other words, there are a group of natural lawyers who try and employ the idea of natural law, which goes all the way back to the Stoics, and says, look, there are certain things that are intrinsically good and intrinsically bad. Everybody else is one way or another stuck with being a conventionalist. Now, being a conventionalist leaves you with a problem of legitimacy. Being a natural lawyer leaves you the problem of explaining how you got in touch with God. Take your pick. Everybody gets a problem that they can't handle.
Okay. So to me, part of reading A Theory of Justice and starting to look at some of the research papers on it and questions on it was there is a part of me that makes it feel like, and this goes into your lecture as well, that makes it feel like his philosophical outlook is so great. What makes his philosophical outlook so great? If it is a concept that in a way goes against human nature, as you kind of said in your lecture, it goes against the individualistic thought. Human nature wants to succeed to a certain extent. Now, there are people who want to really work hard just because they enjoy working hard. There are people who have talents, as you said in your lecture, in the sense of Einstein or a doctor or whomever. So why, human nature in a sense is a survival mentality to a certain extent. So if society were to give up benefits for themselves to help others succeed, isn't that a fight against human nature in a way? I'm not saying I don't agree with his thought process of equality for the masses, but it's that idea.
You're right. Every moral theory is trying to modify human conduct, right?
Okay.
And so it's not unique to Rawls, which means that however the world is and however people do behave, moral theorists of every description are going to be saying that there's something different from what is, and that's what should be, and that you're all missing the boat, right? Whether they're religious or rational, all moral theorists, with the possible exception of Alexander Pope, the poet who once said everything that is right. If you think that there's anything wrong with the world, you're a moral theorist, right? So we're stuck with that idea that we live in an imperfect world. What the imperfections amount to and how we get rid of them, that's the substance of the dispute among moral theorists. Rawls, I think, has given us a real contribution because he reminds us that we have an obligation not to sacrifice those for whom we don't give a care. Jesus says it more elegantly. He says, look, if you hurt them, you hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't think it's completely possible for Rawls to unchristianize himself. I think it's possible for him to change his lingo and use a different rhetorical strategy to explain why it is you should be nice to weak people. But I think it amounts to the same idea.
Okay. That actually helps. That helps me get a little bit more on board with Rawls. As you said in your lecture, I don't necessarily disagree with anything that he said in theory, but there's enough, for lack of a better term, holes in his theory that I just can't see it working out. So I have two final questions. And once again, I do invite anybody else who has a final question for the professor to put it in there. One is just more of a clarification. One of the things that you really focused on at the beginning of your lecture was the social contract, right? The social contract was something that was really developed by some philosophers in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, with the theory that that everybody in society, especially once a political organization is established, has a contract of some sort. Did he actually forego this, or isn't his veil of ignorance and equality for the masses almost a contract in and of itself? Like, isn't it by putting a new theory out there as to how you could potentially run a government with equality for everybody, that would be in itself its own social contract, wouldn't it?
Well, it would require a social contract because it's not supposed to be coercive. It has to be voluntary because of our first principle, giving people maximum liberty. That's why that's so well thought out. The social contract was associated, and still is, with the consent of the governed, right? Which means that's going to be our standard of legitimacy. Did the people choose this? So Rawls' social contract differs from the social contract of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and people like that, in that he says, look, those guys were giving you a myth because they claimed that it actually happened, that all the cavemen got together and they all put their clubs down and they elected Joe president or king or something, and that's where societies come from. That's silly, right? Rawls says, look, I don't want to place too many burdens on your credulity too early. So he says, rather than thinking of those social contracts as a thing that actually happened in history, let's say hypothetically, we were offered that chance. So now we move from the historical to the hypothetical, and that allows him to manipulate it any way he wants, but still get that idea of unanimity of agreement. Okay.
I'm understanding that now. Thank you very much for that clarification. Finally, my final question was, it just, every time I heard it, I had to ask you is, you got near the end, the conclusion of being, you mentioned intellectual calisthenics in a way that Rawls was not convincing in his arguments, that it's more theory-based or whatever, and that ultimately you weren't convinced in his arguments. What would Rawls have had to do to convince you? Like, what possibly would have been something either in his theory, in a breakdown of his theory, an additional argument? Like, where did he miss the boat in what you think would have pushed more of
Okay.
the convincing?
Okay. Every moral theorist wants to give us the silver bullet that kills the werewolf of evil. The problem is, I suspect there is no one such thing. Rather, we have lots of rounds in the gun. And for different situations, we deploy different weapons. So my point is that I don't think that Rawls, if you push him to the point where we're going to do some minor harm and forego curing cancer, I think that he's trapped in his own machine, right? Most people, most of the time, are not going to sign on for that. And I don't think that they're irrational or immoral. I think that there are limitations to every constructed moral and political theory, which is not to say that they're not valuable. I think Rawls is really valuable. I think Aristotle's valuable. I think Kant and Mill are valuable. But I think that they've oversold themselves. I think that what we need is to have all of those in our toolkit in judging moral ethics and politics, but that we have to know what the right tool for the job is, right? There are some situations in which we pull out Mill. There are other situations like where we burn the witch, where we put Mill back in the box, and I take out Kant and I'm saying, I'm not burning the old lady. It's just wrong. Other times we say, well, we create the greatest good for the greatest number, but you look at the great evil that could be created in that respect, like slavery or like various kinds of political or religious or whatever subordination, and you say, no, I don't want that. So all of the moral and political theorists, the great ones, are still great. But the problem is, I think that ultimately Aristotle is right in the following sense. You need what he called phronesis. And that's Greek word usually translated as good judgment. You need to know when to use what tool.
Right? I
Right?
like that. And that would be a great way to end. However, I do have two more questions that slipped in. If you have just a couple extra minutes, we can fit them in a little bit quickly. The first one being is I've read articles contrasting Robert Nozick's theory that with Rawls as justice as entitlement versus justice as fairness, respectively. What exactly is entitlement in this context, and is it not the same thing as right?
I don't know how to distinguish it from rights because I don't know the article you're talking about. But Nozick was one of the great responders to Rawls. He was in the same philosophy department at Harvard. So they got a chance to talk this over at lunch again and again and again. So Nozick wrote a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, in which he tried to sketch out what he thought was tyrannical and excessive about Rawls. And so what he had was a kind of minimal state, it was a sort of libertarian retort to Rawls. And this, quite a bit of our ordinary moral intuitions will be consistent with a libertarian, or I think will be consistent with Nozick rather than Rawls. A good example would be here in town. I like to go fishing. I go fishing on the pier. One guy catches a fish. Here's the question for political philosophers. Who owns the fish? The guy that caught it or everybody on the pier? Now, being Americans now, I think most of us are going to say it would be wrong for us each to pull a tiny piece of that fish away from him, that it's his fish. On the other hand, the Rawlsian would say, no. It's like winning the fish lottery. There's no moral valence to that, so you have to give everybody a piece of the fish. I think that Nozick's libertarian view has some points that are well worth making.
Okay. And then final question, I promise. Who and how decides that who and how decides that what do the least among us need to justify the inequality to improve their condition? It seems like the needs of the least among us could easily become an excuse for injustice. Is that true in your opinion?
Well, yeah, when I pointed out the every moral and political theory has its nightmare cases.
Mhm.
And guys like me work at figuring out what the nightmare cases look like. So the nightmare cases for Rawls are going to look like the nightmare cases for Kant, that he's going to turn down, unjustly, one might say, a cure for cancer if it requires him to break the moral rule and treat someone badly. Suppose we take a lottery in America or in the world, 8 billion people, to find out that 1 in the 8 billion is going to get killed as a result. Well, the utilitarian says, do the math. Obviously, we should do this. The Kantian and the Rawlsian say, no, we don't play that game.
Okay.
So that I would be tempted to say, that's an example of where being a strict Kantian or a strict Rawlsian is going to become, in my view, excessive. There I can't follow them.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate the conversation as always. It's been enlightening. It's been this one was one that was a struggle for me. I did make it through most of the book.
It's a hard book,
but it's a very hard book, and I kept finding myself, on different tracks, which is why I watched your lecture as well as did a lot more research on it. So it's a very interesting thought process, though, as most of the political conversations are. If you are enjoying the Classics Revisited series with Professor Michael Sugrue, our next webinar will be on September 14th with Melville's great novel, Moby Dick. So we're getting away from the political philosophy and going into some fun, larger literature. We have also set up a lecture per month for the remainder of the year, including titles like Ulysses, The Brothers Okay, please say this title for me.
Karamazov.
Karamazov.
Yes.
I'll get it at one point. I need to read it still, and then I'll for sure get it. And The Magic Mountain. So be sure to keep an eye on our website for those. I believe Kenzie actually just put in the Moby Dick registration into the chat. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, Bibliotheca is always continually adding to our virtual event lineup. We invite you to view all on-demand and upcoming events online at bibliotheca.com, and then navigate to our Insights and Trends blog, and make sure you are subscribed to receive all of our webinar updates. And finally, for those of you who have either already answered a survey, you're more than welcome to answer it again, specifically on a theory of justice, or if you're new to our lectures and our webinar series, we'd love to hear your feedback. If you have questions, comments, ideas, let us know. We love to hear from you and use your feedback to continually evolve the webinar series we offer to libraries around the world. Just a reminder, we will circulate that chat log and the links to resources in our follow-up email, so keep an eye out for those in your inbox. As always, thank you so much for attending, and we hope you had a great work break. I have to slow down a little bit. A great work break, and we look forward to having you the next time for Moby Dick. Have a great day.